And welcome to tonight's Rural City of Wangaratta Council meeting. Just a couple of quick points of order before we get going. Firstly is that this public meeting is being recorded to improve access to the meeting for our community. The recording will be published and will be retained by Council in accordance with Council's legal obligations. If you submitted a question, your name and question will be recorded. We'll be constantly live streaming. If it does break at the time of the live streaming, we will break until it is reinstated. I wish to begin by acknowledging the Bangarang as our original inhabitants of whose country we are gathered, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and future, and extend the respect of any First Nation people present online today. Will you please stand for the opening prayer? Almighty God, we humbly ask Thee to bless and guide this council in its deliberations so that we may truly preserve the welfare of the people whom we serve. Amen. Sorry about that. I've lost my content page somewhere. Maybe. There it is. Sorry. Thank you. Sorry about that. There's no citizenship ceremonies tonight. Can I have a confirmation of the previous minutes from last council meeting, please? Can I have a mover, please? Councillor Benton, and a seconder, Councillor Fitzpatrick. All those in favour? Thank you. The motion is carried. There's no conflicts of interest on any of the proceedings here tonight, and we'll continue down to officers' reports. And I will start with corporate services, our community section satisfaction survey 2020 results. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Mayor Rees. So item 13.1, community satisfaction survey 2020 results. This is a statewide local government community satisfaction survey that we undertake annually via an independent third party who surveys our local community principally by telephone surveys. I'm pleased to report that the results this year are very positive, with either steady improvement or continuation of pretty much all of the measures assessed against bar 1 or 2. For our council's overall performance, the rating has improved to 62, up 3 points from the previous year. And above the average for comparable other regional councils who have a score of average of 56. And for overall council direction, our score was 61, which is 11 points higher than the average for other regional centres, so again, some good improvements there. So the full report is attached in the agenda papers. And the recommendation is that Council notes the results of the 2020 Community Satisfaction Survey. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Since there's no questions from the gallery, can I have someone to move that motion, please? Councillor Bussell and Councillor Fuller. Would anyone like to speak on the motion? Councillor Bussell, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As a council, we're always looking for ways to improve outcomes for our community. These results are encouraging as they show that community perception of council has steadily improved over the past 4 years to a very strong position. For overall performance, our council's rating is above the state average and above the average for regional centres. For overall council direction, Wangaratta scored significantly higher than the statewide and regional average. Areas that have improved include building and planning permits, business and community development, and informing the community. These are all areas that we as councillors have focused on over the past 4 years. But we know that there's always room for improvement. We want to build on the gains that have been made and address concerns, especially in rural areas where unsealed roads remain a priority. Overall, these are results worth celebrating, but with the commitment that we will always be striving to be the best regional centre in Victoria and Australia. And Mr Mayor, I'm very, very proud of the work we've done over the last 4 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bussell. Would any other councillor like to talk on the recommendation? No, I'll put the recommendation to a vote. All those in favour? The motion is carried. Thank you, Sarah. Infrastructure Services 15.1 Draft Parklands Master Plan. Thank you, Alan Clark.
This report's presented to Council to consider endorsing the draft Parklands Master Plan to be placed on public exhibition. The Parklands Precinct is an area of about 56 hectares. It houses some of our premier recreational facilities. And the draft master plan provides a vision, design principles and key projects for the precinct to guide the development and use of the facilities over the next 20 years or so. The recommendation is that Council endorse the draft Parklands master plan for a 60-day public exhibition period, seeking feedback from the community and stakeholders until close of business on Friday, 28 of August 2020. And secondly, if no submissions requesting changes to the master plan are received, adopts the draft master plan without further resolution.
Thank you. There are no questions from the gallery that have come in on that. Can I please have someone to move that? Councillor Clark and Councillor Fitzpatrick to second. Would anybody, councillor, like to talk on this recommendation put forward? I'll take that as a no. I'll put the motion to a vote. All those in favour? The motion is carried. Thank you, Alan. 15.2, please. Place naming committee membership.
Council to consider appointing 7 members to the place naming committee. The committee at the moment has dropped to 4 members, whilst the charter allows up to 9 members. The 4 existing members have all re-nominated and a further 3 people have nominated or self-nominated for positions on the committee. So the recommendation is that Council appoint 7 members to the place naming committee for terms nominated, effective immediately, and write to members advising them of their appointment.
Thank you, Alan. Again, no questions from the gallery. Can I have a mover? Councillor Clark, and a seconder, Councillor Fuller.
I would like to give the names of the people who have been successful.
Please,
Julie Allen, Margaret Pullen, Andy Kimber, Ben Watts, who are retiring members, David James and Dawn Fox for 3-year terms, and Neil Brock for a 2-year term. So I have much pleasure in announcing those appointments.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. Would anybody like to talk on this recommendation? Nope. I'll put the recommendation to a vote. All those in favour? The motion is carried. Thank you, Councillor Clark, and thank you, Alan Clark. We'll move on to 16.1. This is Development Services. 16.1 is the Planning Scheme Amendment C76, Wangaratta Industrial Land Use Strategy, the panel report and the next steps in the amendment process, and I'll hand over to our Development Services Manager, Stephen Swart.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. This Planning Scheme Amendment C76 seeks to implement the recommendations of the Wangaratta Industrial Land Use Strategy, which Council adopted at a meeting in October 2017. The amendment was exhibited, and as a result of that process, we received 11 submissions. Council considered these submissions at a meeting in November last year and resolved to make some changes to the amendment and to refer the amendment to a panel. The panel process has now been concluded, and the panel report recommends adopting the amendment subject to some minor changes. The officer recommendation is on the screen there and includes a recommendation for Council to adopt the amendment with the changes as recommended by the panel and to submit the amendment to the Minister for Planning for approval.
Thank you, Stephen. Questions from the gallery. There is one. Stephen, if I may indulge you, I'll ask this question and expect your reply. Good evening, councillors. I'll just stipulate this is from Ray and Rhonda Stamp, who obviously own property close by the or within the buffer zone relating to C76. In relation to the officer's comments regarding our submission to reduce the buffer areas around Mackay casings, you have stated you would not consider planning permits without an odour assessment to demonstrate protection of public health. EPA Victoria Business, Industry and Planning Guidance state businesses are responsible to ensure their activities do not cause odour impacts off-site. If Mackay casings are meeting their obligations, why should we bear the costs associated with an odour assessment and the potential rejection of a planning permit to prove our land is not affected by their industry? Regards, Ray and Rhonda Stamp.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. In response, I thought I'd start by talking about the panel process and what the panel discussed during that process about the buffer areas. They specifically considered the strategic buffers proposed by the planning scheme amendment and concluded that the buffers are strategically justified and consistent with the EPA publication 1518, and notes that the agent of change must prove that they can be varied. Now, I'll talk about the agent of change principle in a minute. In the panel report from page 18 onwards, there's quite a bit of discussion about this. And the panel, after all of that discussion, makes a recommendation specifically about the strategic buffers. It recommends that a specific strategy be included in the planning scheme as a result of this amendment. And that strategy is to protect the operation of Mackay casings and the Wangaratta sale yards by requesting that a permit application or planning scheme amendment proposing to introduce or intensify a sensitive use on land in the strategic buffer include an odour assessment which demonstrates the buffer can satisfactorily be reduced. The proposed strategic buffer was supported by the EPA during the development of the industrial land use strategy in 2017, and the EPA also supported the planning scheme amendment process. The EPA publication that I mentioned before guided the establishment of strategic buffers and supports the agent of change principle that applies to this buffer. This means that in a case where a sensitive land use, such as a residential use, is proposed within the budget, then the agent of change, which is the proponent of that development, would then carry the burden to provide the evidence required. It should be noted that the buffer as proposed by this planning scheme amendment will not be a planning permit trigger on its own. So it will depend on other provisions in the scheme to trigger the need for a planning permit. And once a planning permit is triggered by something else like the zoning, then this strategy will come into play.
Thank you, Stephen. You're happy to forward that response to the stamps as well?
I am.
Thank you. Can I have a mover, please? Councillor Clark, and a seconder? Councillor Benton. Would any councillor like to talk on this recommendation? Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. When I saw this amendment going through the buffer zones, I thought back to the 80s when Mackay casings were first operational out there, and they weren't called Mackay casings then, but Bill Mackay did run that casings factory, and the odours that we received in the city in those years was something terrible, and they weren't able to put buffer zones in then. They've got them now, and I think that it's a great thing to save us from odours that we don't want.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. Any other councillor like to speak on the recommendation? No. I'll put the recommendation forward. All those in favour? The motion is carried. Thank you. We'll move on to number 19 on their record of assemblies of councillors, 19.1. Thank you, Brendan.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. So this item deals with assemblies of councillors and advisory committee reports, primarily from May and into early June, and they're presented there for council to receive and endorse.
Thank you. Can I have a mover, please? Councillor Fitzpatrick. Seconder, Councillor Clark. Would anyone like to speak on this? Imagine not. All those in favour of the recommendation? The recommendation is passed. Thank you, everybody. Now, I'm just going to move on to a notice of motion that I'm putting forward as the Mayor, and I'll give a little bit of background on item 20, notice of motion for this situation. I, Councillor Dean Rees, give notice of intention to move the following at the ordinary council meeting tonight. And the background is there has been recent community-led campaign requesting that Faithful Street be renamed. As a consequence of reported historic references relating to the treatment of Indigenous people by the town's pioneers. A number of submissions have been made to Council which demonstrate a variety of opinions exist on this issue. Initial high-level consultation with local Indigenous people suggests that renaming may not be the favoured course of action and that all history is important and should be retold and learned from. So the motion or recommendation that I'm putting forward is that Council directs officers to undertake appropriate engagement with local Indigenous networks and other interested stakeholders to discuss the recent community campaign to rename Faithful Street, to determine whether this is an appropriate course of action and to provide Council with a recommendation. Can I have a seconder for that recommendation? Councillor Benton. Would any councillor like to talk on the recommendation? Councillor Clark, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Whilst I have a very open mind about the issue, I've spent some time over the past few days trying to get a picture of what really took place 162 years ago. I've read and reread the documentation contained in Dr. Whittaker's book, Wangaratta, published in '63, the Wangaratta Story by Bill O'Callaghan, published in 2009, and the Gold, Grog and Good Ground, published in 2009 by Rice Sample. All, Whittaker's on page 18 to 21, give an actual account of the series of events as written by George Faithful at Roman numerals 14 and 15 in the Wangaratta Story by Bill O'Callaghan. Also contains a reference to the events that took place in April 1838. On pages 24 and 25 of Gold, Grog and Good Ground, there is evidence of an attack on Faithful, which, although no date is given, must have been the attack at Winding Swamp in Benalla on April the 10th, 1838. It is my belief that this was the first confrontation between Faithful and the Aborigines, which resulted in the death of one Aboriginal and 8 white men. Faithful returned to the ovens, Wangaratta, but returned after leaving Wangaratta on the 15th of April to recover his sheep and cattle. The account written by Colonel White talks of the first encounter on April the 10th. In my reading of the book, Cooperative War Party, which is the one that started all this, which has just been released, at chapter 14, in my reading of the book, Cooperative War Party, at chapter 14. Was there retaliation by the Europeans against the Panganang trade? It would appear there was, but no definite detail is provided in respect of the supposed massacre at Winding Swamp. A lot of hearsay, a lot of letters written, but really no evidence to verify what transpired. Of interest to me was that 10 of the first 11 streets named in Wangaratta had squatters' names. only ovens being used in honour of Governor King's aide-de-camp. It's surprising that many of the stations were subjected to attacks and pilfering, including the Reverend Docker, but only Faithful has been signalled out for change. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. Would anybody else like to talk on the recommendation? Councillor Curry. Councillor Benton.
As the motion says, Mr Mayor, that we are starting the investigation into this, and I don't think it's right for us to judge history. History's there, whether it's good or bad. And I think going forward, we've got to bring this thing's got to come back to bring us together. If it's going to divide us, I will not be supporting it in the recommendation. If it doesn't bring this community together and support this community, because whatever has happened in the past has happened. In recent times, doesn't matter whether we've been overseas or here, there's been terrible atrocities and there's been good things in history, but it's there and we can't alter it. All I am going to say, though, is that anyone that's going to pass judgment on any of this, let them who has not sinned shall cast the first stone. So make sure that when they do get the recommendation, it brings us together. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Benton. Councillor Curry.
Just like to say history's a funny thing. You know, it's one person's interpretation of a one-sided event. And there's always, we all know there's two sides to every story. I think this is going to be a very sensitive matter, no matter which side you look at and which way you look at it. And I request that we tread very carefully with this moving forward and take into consideration all sides. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Curry. Councillor Russell.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor, and I do agree with what Councillor Curry said in most. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. That was come from George Santayana. There is no doubt that George Faithful is at best an ambiguous character. He is rightly recognised for the pioneering role he played in the establishment of European settlement in northeast Victoria. Until recently, history has been relatively silent on his engagement with First Australians. There is little documentary evidence about the Benalla massacre of faithful stockmen and the subsequent killing of Aboriginal people on the Broken River, other than the letter which Faithful himself wrote to Lieutenant Governor Latrobe. The letter seeks to minimise the involvement of Faithful and his men and cast blame on the First Australians. A more critical view of the killing of Aborigines by Faithful and his men can be found in Benalla historian Judith Bassett's essay in the Quadrant. The recent reaction to the Black Lives Matter protest arising from the death of George Floyd, an African-American killed when a white police officer kneeled on his neck for 8 minutes, has led to a global re-evaluation of the meaning and value of historical monuments. The dark side of our history has not been well acknowledged, and there is some sympathy to be had for those who want to see removed symbols by name and statue, which are silent about the ambiguities of history. The background to the notice of motion in the name of Mayor Rees acknowledges that there are conflicting opinions in the community on the question whether Faithful Street should be renamed. It is pleasing to note that there has already been initial high-level consultation with local Indigenous people. Too often, we have dealt with issues concerning First Australians without permitting their voice to be heard. The motion seeks a further period of consultation to explore the best solution. Of course, consultation is an important part of a decision-making process, and the motion therefore deserves support. It is interesting to note that the initial high-level consultations with Indigenous people has raised the question whether or not renaming is the best response. Whilst awaiting results of the process of consultation, It is important to note that whatever the outcome, the notion of truth-telling should remain paramount in Council's consideration. I support the motion.
Thank you, Councillor Bussell. Any further councillors? Councillor Fuller.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I support the motion as well, and note that the success that we've had with the Bullawa Trail shows that when we do consultation correctly with as many people as possible, that we can actually come out with a really good outcome. So I look forward to seeing a great deal of consultation with all stakeholders involved in the conversation.
Thank you, Councillor Fuller. Nothing further from councillors? Councillor Fitzpatrick, yes, sorry.
The notice of motion, but Mr. Mayor, would it be a great idea to maybe put some examples out of what this could look like for Wangaratta? You know, what are some alternative motions, recommendations we could be seeking from our community? It is an issue that we, do want to take carefully into consideration. So I think a few prompts would be great.
Thank you, Councillor Fitzpatrick. I'll end off by saying that that many potential outcomes could come up with this recommendation back to council, and this could mean some storytelling or some sort of significant plaquing or trails, etc., that explain the story fully. But I agree with Councillor Bussell that that storytelling is the best way to put things forward, and the truth on what comes forward from any of these storyboards or recognition of what happened. But maybe changing the name may not be that process. But we'll wait and see what the recommendation comes back to council at, and we'll decide from there. So I'll put the motion to a vote. All those in favour? The motion is carried. There is no urgent business, confidential business, so we'll go to public question time, and there are a couple of questions that I will read out and get an answer. This question is from a Martin Nicol, and there is two questions from Martin from memory here. The first question is, following on from the much media coverage about the securing energy supplies in an uncertain future, what steps do you see the rural city of Wangaratta taking to address this? Water security is a very current issue across Australia, and what role do you think the rural city of Wangaratta can play in addressing this to ensure we do not run out of water in Wangaratta? Energy Supplies Council is continually exploring new opportunities within the energy space, noting in particular the role of the renewables. Council's role includes advocacy, improving sustainability in our community and within our own operations, and working with our authorities and developers to facilitate local energy generation projects in appropriate locations. Some of the specific actions we are taking include seeking to set new renewable energy targets in our environmental sustainability strategy that is currently being drafted, exploring opportunities to purchase green power directly and constantly seeking ways to become more sustainable by installing solar on our facilities, with the most recently a 60 kilowatt system currently being installed at the Wysack and part of the aquatics project, assisting community halls with previous solar installations and energy efficient projects, and promoting renewable energy opportunities within our communities. In our broader region, there are many changes occurring, as can be seen with numerous solar farms projects and the Hume Region Renewable Energy Roadmap that was released by the state government that outlines what a future sustainable renewable energy landscape could look like for our region and the community. Moving on to water security. Council and two of Council's advisory committees, the Economic Development and Agriculture, acknowledge the importance of water security within our municipality, particularly with the ongoing dry seasonal conditions, increased water demand, urban expansion, changes to water allocations and environmental quality. Council recognises the complexity around water and water security. As such, Council is currently working to develop strong advocacy documents that assist Council industry and communities to stress the importance on ongoing protecting of our water distribution and usage within our catchment, and to ensure the sustainability of both surface and groundwater supplies to support opportunities for growth. Council works closely with relevant authorities like North East Water to plan for future growth and ensure sufficient water supply is available. Council also continues to work on programs that look at climate adaptation, including water efficiency and providing additional drought points to assist with access to water. Thank you. I have another question from a Rose Wedler. Rosemary Ruth Redler, and good morning. Question number 1. With the rise of domestic violence and pressure on sustainable housing, what role has the Wangaratta City Council played in addressing this? I'll answer question 1 there first. Family violence prevention has been a priority of Council for several years. We've been working in partnership with local organisations and agencies to support initiatives that work to prevent as well as respond to complex issues of violence and abuse within the home. We understand that the current environment and social isolation has for some families escalated violence and abuse. Whilst we do not provide direct access to services and housing, Council has a prominent role in lobbying, advocacy and planning. We recently represented the needs of our community at the public inquiry into homelessness. Council is also working through the transition of the Max Parkinson's Lodge to Beyond Housing, who will develop the land into self-contained affordable living homes for people within our community. Question 2. Considering the diverse development planned in the municipality in the near future, what tangible measures have been put in place to ensure flora and fauna are sustainably protected? Have trees been identified and put under protective covenant so that they cannot be removed without depth, genuine consultation by all parties concerned? Council knows that protecting our environment is important to the community. That's why we take steps to protect and enhance biodiversity. This includes ensuring long-term strategic planning for growth and development considers how environmental assets will be protected and vegetation retained. Example, our precinct structure plans for our growth areas. These planning projects are open to community input. A planning scheme that preserves existing environmental features while also requiring new plantings and making other environmental contributions. The planning scheme requires avoidance of native vegetation removal and in the first instance. Where native vegetation removal cannot be avoided, a planning permit is generally required to remove vegetation. If approved, will require offsets. Public notice of planning applications gives people the opportunity to provide comment or object to vegetation removal if they choose to. Working to increase the overall vegetation cover in the municipality with a target in our environment sustainability strategy of 2,000 new plants per year. Our annual planting is between 7,000 and 9,000 new plants. Thank you, Rose. Thank you. The next one is from Cassandra Pollock. Hello to the administration staff at the rural city of Wangaratta. I submit the following questions to the rural city of Wangaratta council meeting to occur on Tuesday the 22nd of June. What did the rural city of Wangaratta do to mark National Reconciliation Week 2020? If there were no initiatives, why not? Cassandra Pollock. Council partners with local Aboriginal networks to deliver the Mamungan Rock ceremony, which, ongoing, is scheduled to be held in Reconciliation Week, subject to availability of the recipient. Unfortunately, this year, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the event had to be cancelled. Council's efforts were focused on supporting the Dirawara through digital adaptation for the event. After preliminary planning of an online delivery of the event, it was decided to postpone the ceremony until a time that the participant, Dr. Warren Garrett, his family and friends, and a wider community could come in person together. In consultation with and on behalf of the Dirrawara, Council has developed a Facebook page as a platform to release important messages and further promote this event. It's www.facebook.com/Mamungan Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, unless any councillor would like to say any comments prior to the end of our meeting here tonight, I think not. I'll call the meeting to a close and thank you for your participation and look forward to seeing you at our next council meeting. Have a great night. Thank you.